Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the land of Mesopotamia, where you find yourself shuffling through dim alleys just before dawn, your sandals scuffing against packed dust, the air heavy with wood smoke and the promise of heat. You hear the rumble of fires long before you see the glow. The bakeries of Babylon never really sleep, but at sunrise they roar awake. The oven's massive dome kilns lined with clay glow orange from within. A few bakers squat nearby, their arms glistening with sweat despite the cool morning air, slapping discs of dough against the hot interior walls. The hiss and pop as each loaf sticks, bubbles and crisps is oddly hypnotic. You step closer and suddenly you're caught by the smell. Nutty roasted grain, hints of onion, maybe even a drizzle of honey if you're lucky. It's the kind of smell that might make you linger even though, spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive eating bread without knowing whether it was rationed for temple workers or a crumb stolen from an account already recorded. Babylon didn't mess around when it came to bread. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The world of early morning Babylon feels both alien and familiar. You're watching men and women prepare something as universal as bread, yet everything about it is drenched in ritual and accounting. Each baker here isn't just tossing flour into an oven. They're serving a machine, the city's machine that needs its bread tallied, measured, distributed, taxed and recorded. The baker doesn't simply bake. He becomes a cog in one of humanity's earliest bureaucracies. Picture this, the city is stirring awake. Temple bells faint in the distance, cattle being driven toward fields, and in this narrow street, bakers shout to each other over the roar of the flames. Loaves are pulled free with hooked sticks and piled onto reed mats to cool. Some are plain barley bread, thick and dark, with a chewy crust that might make you long for butter that won't arrive for millennia. Others are sprinkled with seeds or brushed with a glaze of dates. And here's the quirky part: archaeologists found that sometimes bread was baked in molds shaped like animals or small cones, maybe as offerings. So yes, even 1,000 years ago, people were already doing Instagram-worthy food styling. Minus the HASHTAGS. What strikes you as you stand there, trying not to cough from the smoke, is how methodical everything is. A boy, probably no older than 12, sits on the ground beside the ovens, scratching marks into a small clay tablet. Each mark is a loaf. His teacher leans over and mutters corrections, smoothing over mistakes with a thumb and pressing in the wedge-shaped stylus again. This is no casual bakery. Every loaf counts because every loaf is an entry in a larger system. Bread isn't just food, it's currency, ration, tax, and even social control. Historians still argue whether these early bakers were free merchants selling at a profit, or temple-bound workers bound to supply quotas. What's certain is that someone had to track the numbers, and that's why the scribes were always nearby, lurking with their tablets. You notice how the bakers look at the scribes now and then with a mix of wariness and annoyance, the way a modern barista might glare at the health inspector. You edge deeper into the bakery. The air grows hotter, your skin prickling with sweat. You can hear the roar inside the ovens. See little sparks leap when someone stokes the coals with dried reeds. You realize why these places opened before dawn. Once the Mesopotamian sun rose high, the heat would become unbearable. Baking at midday here would be like volunteering for a sauna session you never asked for. So, mornings it is. In the corner, a pile of grain sacks leans against the wall, their rough fibers brushing against each other whenever someone grabs a handful. Barley, mostly wheat, is rare and precious here. Barley is what keeps the city alive, and barley bread is what most people eat. The bakers scoop, grind, mix with water, and knead until the dough is pliable. The rhythmic slap of dough against stone is like a heartbeat, steady and persistent. You half expect someone to start chanting, just to keep time. One baker pulls out a flat round loaf, puffs his cheeks, and blows away the ash clinging to the crust. He grins, takes a bite, and then offers you a piece. You hesitate because, let's be real, you don't know if this is for you or for the temple god down the street, but the smell is too much. It tastes dense, earthy, almost sour. Not bad. If you overlook the crunch of the occasional grit, ancient flour wasn't exactly filtered through high-end stainless steel mills. Let's just say your dentist would have steady work. The morning rolls forward. Workers drift in, some picking up their daily rations, others delivering grain for processing. The bakery feels less like a cozy shop and more like a hub in a sprawling system. You're not just standing in a kitchen, you're inside one of the beating hearts of a civilization. Every loaf has meaning. Every loaf has a number. And every loaf must be written down before anyone dares to take a bite. As you lean against the wall, blinking against the smoke, you realize this isn't just a scene about food, it's a scene about control, ritual, and survival. Babylonian bakers weren't just flour-covered artisans. They were nodes in a network watched by scribes tied to temples. And bound by the city's appetite for both calories and accountability, you inhale again. The mix of bread, smoke, and sweat heavy in your lungs. The city hums louder now. Somewhere outside, traders are opening their stalls, children are shouting, and priests are preparing to measure the day with rituals. Inside the bakery, the first stacks of loaves are ready, neat little hills waiting to be carried away. You can almost hear the whisper of history reminding you, bread was never just bread. It was always math, always records, always the quiet sound of stylus on clay, keeping track of who ate and who owed. You step back from the ovens, blinking at the glowing embers, and now your attention drifts to the quiet corner where the real magic, or maybe the real tedium happens. A scribe sits cross-legged on the packed earth floor, his reed stylus poised, like a dagger of bureaucracy. He's not doodling little stick figures for fun. He's counting loaves. Each steaming disk of barley bread that leaves the oven gets acknowledged, with a mark pressed into a soft clay tablet. It's rhythmic, bread, press, a pace as steady as the baker's kneading. You watch the scribe pause occasionally, tapping the stylus against his palm, as though double-checking his own work. You get the sense this is serious business. In a city where thousands of workers depend on their rations being properly allocated, losing count isn't just embarrassing, it could lead to famine, unrest, or, worst-case scenario, an awkward conversation with an angry temple administrator. Imagine getting fired in 2000 BCE because you miscounted bread by 5 loaves. That's worse than forgetting to clock in at Starbucks. The system here is deceptively simple. Each loaf equals a small symbol. But here's the twist. Not all loaves are equal. Some are bigger, some smaller, some flavored with onions, dates, or sesame. Each one might have its own symbol. And sometimes tokens are used instead of marked small. Clay pieces shaped like cones or spheres, dropped into a jar to represent numbers. It's like the world's earliest Excel spreadsheet, but with way more clay dust and zero chance of a digital crash. And you notice a boy apprentice fumbling nearby, his tablet smeared with clumsy wedge marks. He tries to mimic the scribes' strokes, but the symbols collapse into something that looks like a chicken stepped across the clay. His master groans, smooths the tablet over with a wet palm, and makes him start again. If you ever complained about math homework, imagine being forced to memorize 100 different wedge shapes, just to record who got their daily bread. Historians still argue whether this system of tokens and tablets was invented specifically for bread, rations, or whether it came earlier for trade in wool and oil. Either way, bread quickly became central. You can almost picture some poor early accountant sighing, "Fine, if we must count sheep, let's at least start with bread, it's easier not to run away." The quirky part? Some tablets weren't just tallies, they included little pictographs of loaves, almost cartoon-like. A fat oval with a few lines could stand in for bread, which means scribes were basically doodling thousands of years before sketchpads hit the art supply store, and these doodles mattered. Archaeologists have found entire warehouses of such tablets, stacked neatly, the ancient equivalent of file cabinets. You imagine some overworked scribe one night, muttering, "If anyone asks me to count another onion loaf, I'm switching careers to goat herding." The atmosphere inside the bakery grows steadily more tense as more loaves pile up. You realize the counting is not casual. It's the glue holding the system together. Without it, how would the temple know which workers were fed? Which farmers had delivered their grain? Which bakers had done their job? Every loaf is like a coin, but unlike coins, you can't just toss it into a chest for later bread molds. Bread disappears, so the tally must be immediate and precise. You glance at the scribe's hands, cracked with clay dust, fingernails permanently stained brown. He works with the weary patience of someone who knows the bread will never stop coming. Not today, not tomorrow, not in his lifetime. Babylon is hungry, and he is one of its human calculators. He sighs, smooths a line, and presses again. Somewhere behind him, the apprentice sneezes into the clay. The master groans. Another tablet ruined. The tablet system isn't just about numbers, it's about power. You realize the scribe's marks carry more weight than the baker's labor. A baker might sweat through the night, pulling dozens of loaves from the fire. But if the scribe fails to record it, officially, it never happened. Bread could vanish in the shuffle, rations could be denied. Taxes could suddenly appear larger than they were. The stylus is sharper than the bread knife, and you hear whispers that sometimes scribes cheated. Maybe a loaf was counted twice, maybe one was left off deliberately to hide theft. Some scholars believe disputes over miscounted bread caused tension between workers and temple administrators. Historians still argue whether these errors were intentional corruption or just human sloppiness. Under a mountain of clay records, you can imagine the scribe shrugging, "Oh, sorry. My stylus slipped. Guess you don't get your bread today." One clay tablet catches your eye. The symbols pressed into it are unusually neat, arranged like rows of tiny soldiers. The scribe glances at it with pride. That one, you sense, will be stored for the temple archives, preserved as a model of perfect bookkeeping. And who knows, maybe for 1,000 years later, archaeologists will dig it up, dust it off, and marvel at its precision, wondering if the scribe had any idea his boring bread math would outlive entire empires. As the morning deepens, you realize the scene isn't about bread anymore. It's about the birth of writing, bureaucracy, and accounting. The act of counting loaves in this smoky corner is part of the story that gave us ledgers, taxes, and, eventually, that awkward call from the IRS you've been dreading. You can thank Babylonian bakers for the spreadsheet on your boss's desk. But in this moment, as the scribe marks another loaf and the apprentice mutters curses at his messy clay, the world feels both ancient and familiar. Bread is life, but bread is also math. And here you are, standing in a hot bakery at dawn, watching humanity invent paperwork just so no one walks off with an extra onion roll. You step away from the smoky ovens and scribbling apprentices, and your feet carry you down a winding street toward the heart of the city. The air smells of incense now, resin burning in braziers, mingling with the ever-present dust. A head rises. A massive temple complex, its stepped ziggurat gleaming faintly in the morning light. You drift closer, and suddenly the focus shifts not to loaves cooling on reed mats, but to the people waiting in lines that snake through the courtyard. Workers, priests, farmers, and even guards all stand patiently, clay bowls in hand. They are here for bread not as customers, but as recipients of rations, the daily lifeblood of Babylon. You slip into the shade of a colonnade and watch as priests oversee the distribution. The bread is not just food, it is sacred, a gift from the gods, baked with ritual precision. Loaves are stacked on low wooden tables, some plain barley discs, others glazed with honey for higher-ranking officials. The priests chant softly, blessing the offerings before they are handed out. You notice how some of the loaves are placed directly onto altars, crumbled as symbolic meals for the gods themselves. The idea is simple: the gods eat first, the people eat later, and somehow everyone nods as though this makes sense. What's striking is how this system doubles as payroll. Workers who haul bricks for temple walls or who dig irrigation canals under the scorching sun are not usually paid in silver. They're paid in bread and beer, rationed carefully, measured precisely. A laborer might receive 2 loaves a day, plus a jug of beer. while a foreman might get for loaves and sweeter cakes. This means bread isn't just nourishment, it's wages. Your loaf is your paycheck. Forget to pick it up, and you've basically skipped your direct deposit. Historians still argue whether this system of rations was efficient or coercive. Was the temple kindly feeding its people, or was it cleverly binding them into dependence? On the one hand, the steady supply of bread kept the workforce alive and loyal. On the other hand, if you angered the temple, they could literally take food from your mouth by cutting your ration. You don't need a PhD in economics to see how dangerous that power could be. As the line shuffles forward, you see women and children too, some receiving smaller rations. A mother breaks her loaf in half immediately, tucking one piece into her bag and handing the other to her toddler. The child gnaws on the crust, crumbs scattering like tiny sparks across the stone pavement. Bread is not glamorous here, it's survival, plain and absolute. And yet, there are quirks. On feast days, special breads are given out, shaped into stars, animals, or even miniature ziggurats. Archaeologists found molds for bread shaped like turtles and fish, probably used in ritual offerings. You can't help but smirk. Babylonians were making novelty bread long before bakeries invented dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets. Apparently, humans have always had a soft spot for food shaped like something else. The priests, meanwhile, keep careful watch. Clay tablets are stacked beside them, records of who received what. You notice the familiar wedge marks, precise and unforgiving. No one walks away with an extra loaf without it being noticed. And there's a subtle reminder of hierarchy. The priests themselves eat first, choosing the finest loaves, while the rest trickle down to the workers. It's a quiet reinforcement of power, baked daily and handed out under the watchful gaze of the gods. As you stand there, you realize the bread lines are more than practical, they are symbolic. To stand in line for rations is to acknowledge the temple's authority, to participate in a ritual that says, you live because we feed you. And it's hard not to draw modern parallels. Swap the clay bowls for plastic ID cards, the priests for HR stuff, and you'd have something eerily familiar. Still, there's a warmth in the scene too. Neighbors greet each other, children chase one another between the lines. Old men joke about the size of today's loaves compared to last year's. Even in bureaucracy, life insists on being messy, human, and sometimes funny. One man pulls a loaf from his bag, sniffs it, and loudly declares it must have been baked by a sleepy apprentice, because it looks like a shoe. Everyone laughs, even the priest trying to stay stern. Bread may be sacred, but humor sneaks in anyway. You notice, tucked behind the main altar, a separate table with loaves that look richer, sweeter, drizzled with date syrup. These are not for the workers. They're for the gods, or, more accurately, for the priests who will later consume them in ceremonies. You watch as one priest solemnly breaks a loaf in half, murmurs a prayer, and places it carefully on a golden dish. The act feels weighty, as though the loaf itself carries messages to the heavens. Bread here is communication, a physical offering meant to please divine appetites. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some texts, the gods are described as literally eating the offerings. Of course, the gods didn't exactly show up to take a bite, but the idea persisted that keeping the gods fed kept the city safe. Forget to deliver the loaves and you risk drought, plague, or invasion. You're not just failing to feed workers, you're failing to feed the cosmos. Talk about pressure on the bakers. The sun climbs higher as the last of the line receives their rations. Loaves disappear into baskets and bags, carried away to be eaten in crowded homes or lonely guard posts along the city walls. The priests gather the remaining tablets, sealing them for storage. The courtyard quiets, except for the faint hum of flies circling the crumbs left on the stone. You step back into the street, your mind buzzing with the realization that bread here is never just bread. It's pay, it's worship, it's social glue. And as you watch the last child clutch his half-loaf-like treasure, you feel the weight of it, how something so simple becomes the foundation of an empire. You follow the trail of crumbs literally down another alley, and suddenly the smell shifts. Instead of the dry, nutty aroma of barley bread, You're hit with something tangier, richer, almost yeasty. A low-roofed shed opens onto the street, and inside you find vats, not ovens. This is where bakers and brewers overlap, where grain transforms into not just loaves but liquid. In Babylon, bread and beer were siblings born of the same barley, kneaded and fermented in different ways and often produced by the same families. You watch a woman scoop a mush of crushed barley into a vat, mixing it with water. The texture looks suspiciously like porridge you'd politely decline at a bad breakfast buffet. But here's the secret. This slurry ferments into beer, thick and cloudy, a staple drink for both workers and nobles. Bread dough and beer mash were cousins, interchangeable stages of grain's endless transformation. In fact, some loaves were baked deliberately undercooked, half raw, so they could be crumbled into water to jumpstart fermentation. Think of it as Babylon's version of a sourdough starter, but with more buzz. The link between beer and bread is so strong that in some texts, the word for food almost automatically implied both. You weren't just asking, "Do you have something to eat?" You were basically asking, "Do you have bread and beer?" And it made sense. Bread filled the belly. Beer hydrated you, or at least killed the germs, and together they kept the workforce standing. Forget vitamin supplements, Babylon's multivitamin came in a combo of crust and brew. Historians still argue whether beer in Babylon was more nutritious than bread, or simply safer to drink than river water. What's clear is that the two products relied on each other. Breweries often sat beside bakeries, sharing supplies and even recipes. You can imagine a baker at dawn saying, "This batch of dough is ruined quick, throw it in the beer vat." Crisis averted and tomorrow's hangover created. Quirky fact, they drank beer through long straws reed tubes plunged into communal jars. Why? Because the beer was thick and gritty, full of floating husks of barley. The straws filtered out the solids. Picture a group of workers hunched over a giant pot, sipping together like teenagers sharing bubble tea, except instead of tapioca pearls, it's barley mush. Not glamorous, but very Mesopotamian. You glance back at the loaves cooling on reed, mats outside the oven. They look almost identical to the chunks tossed into brewing vats. It hits you. The line between baker and brewer was blurry. One hand kneaded dough, the other stirred mash. In some texts, the goddess Ninkasi, deity of beer, is praised in hymns that describe the baking of bread as part of her recipe. Bread wasn't just sacred to the gods of food, it was sacred to the gods of drink. A boy brings in sacks of grain, and you notice how carefully they're weighed. Too much grain to the bakers, not enough to the brewers, and suddenly rations fall short. This delicate balance explains why accountants lurked nearby. Every loaf and every jar of beer was part of a massive calculation, ensuring that workers got their share, priests got their offerings, and nobody hopefully starved. As you linger, you can't help chuckling at the thought of how universal this combo is. Bread and beer, pizza and soda, tacos and margaritas. Humans just love pairing solid carbs with liquid carbs. It's comforting, primal. The Babylonians didn't have pizza joints, but they nailed the vibe. The scene grows livelier as workers finish their shifts. A group of laborers shuffle in, bowls in hand, waiting for their ration of beer. The brewer dips a ladle, pours the cloudy liquid and hands it over. One man tears a chunk of bread and dunks it, letting it soak before chewing. It's messy, but you can see why it works. The bread stretches the beer softens the bread. Together, they make survival almost palatable. You think about how fragile this balance must have been. If the grain harvest failed, it wasn't just bread that disappeared, it was beer, wages, offerings, and even ritual. Grain shortages meant no beer for the gods, no bread for the workers, and no rations to keep soldiers loyal. Entire empires teetered on the edge of a soggy barley loaf. Historians still debate whether some uprisings in Mesopotamia were fueled less by politics and more by hungry workers denied their daily ration of bread and brew. Honestly, who wouldn't riot? And there's something strangely human about the whole setup. Bread is sustenance, beer is comfort. The Babylonians may have dressed it up with rituals and accounting, but deep down, they knew what we still know: life is easier to swallow with a drink in one hand. and a crust in the other. The vats bubble, the ovens hiss, and the scribes scratch. You stand at the crossroads of food and drink, realizing that in Babylon there was no separating them. Bread was beer, beer was bread, and together they were the foundation of daily life, divine worship, and occasionally a really bad hangover. The street bends again, and suddenly you're standing before the looming silhouettes of grain silos massive. Clay towers rising above the city like oversized beehives. Their domed tops catch the sunlight, while their bases sit cool and shadowed. From a distance they look solid, reassuring. Up close, though, you can hear the constant murmur of disputes. Grain is wealth, and wealth attracts arguments. You edge closer, brushing past men in dusty tunics, their arms waving as they shout numbers at one another. One official swears the silo should contain 100 bushels. Another claims 95. A third, clutching a tablet, insists that last month's tally already accounted for missing grain. The quarrel isn't over a few handfuls, it's over survival. In Babylon, one lost bushel could mean one less ration, one angry worker, or one deity left unfed. The scribes crouch nearby, styluses stabbing at clay. They scratch wedge marks furiously, trying to keep up with the cascade of accusations. The smell of barley is heavy in the air, nutty and faintly sour. A farmer opens one sack, and the grain slips through his fingers in a golden stream, catching the light before hitting the ground. He gestures wildly, shouting that his harvest was larger than what's recorded. You can almost hear him thinking, "They're cheating me," and perhaps they are. Historians still argue whether Babylonian officials skimmed grain for themselves, or whether natural shrinkage rats, moisture, theft along the transport routes was to blame. The truth probably lies somewhere between corruption and rodents. Either way, the grain silos were less symbols of abundance than battlegrounds of accountability. Here's a quirky fact. Sometimes seals were pressed directly onto the doors of the silos. Little clay blobs stamped with the unique imprint of an official's cylinder seal. If the seal was broken, everyone knew someone had sneaked in. Think of it as a Bronze Age tamper-proof sticker. The Mesopotamian equivalent of void if seal broken. You imagine some sneaky worker trying to pry it off carefully, sweating under the suspicion of dozens of watchful eyes. You step around the base of a silo and feel the heat radiating from its walls. Inside, it's dark and cool, with shafts of light cutting through small holes near the top. The grain rustles faintly, alive with the sound of tiny creatures moving through it. A rat darts out, and one of the guards stomps after it, muttering curses. You realize how impossible it must have been to keep track of grain here. Every handful was food, drink, tax, and tithe, and every handful could vanish in 1,000 small ways. The arguments swell louder. One man insists that last week's delivery from the countryside never made it into the silo. Another blames corrupt haulers. A scribe sighs and smooths out a clay tablet, starting again. His stylus flicks quickly, as though he knows the numbers. Won't satisfy anyone, but at least they'll be written down. In a way, the record is more important than the truth. If it's on clay, it exists. If it isn't, well, good luck convincing the temple you actually delivered your barley. You notice how much ritual surrounds the silos too. Before a new harvest is poured in, priests often sprinkle water, chant blessings, and anoint the doorway with oil. The grain isn't just storage, it's sacred sustenance for gods and men alike. Lose it to theft or rot, and it's more than a bookkeeping error. It's a spiritual crisis. And while the officials argue, a group of women quietly scoop grain from another silo, measuring it into baskets for the bakeries. Their movements are methodical, efficient, almost invisible compared to the shouting men. Yet they're the ones who ensure the bread ovens keep burning tomorrow. Without them, the arguments would be meaningless because there'd be no loaves to fight over in the first place. A guard notices you watching and gestures at the towering silos. He smirks, then whispers, "You know what happens when the silos are empty? Nothing good." He taps his stomach, then drags a finger across his throat in a grim joke. Hunger is never far from these disputes, and everyone knows it. You can't help but think of modern warehouses, forklifts, spreadsheets, barcodes. The Babylonians had none of those, just human memory, clay tablets, and the occasional clay seal. And yet, the problems are timeless: missing shipments, suspected theft, bickering accountants, rats in the storage bins. Thousands of years later, and office managers are still arguing about who misplaced the inventory. The sun beats down as the shouting fades into weary murmurs. Another tally is taken, another seal pressed, another compromise reached. The grain may or may not be where it's supposed to be, but at least everyone has a number to cling to. And as you walk away from the silos, the voices echo after you. A reminder that bread was never just about baking. It began here, in the endless counting of golden kernels. You leave the towering silos behind, ears still ringing with the echoes of grain arguments. And soon the street opens into a wide, bustling square. The city gates loom at one end, massive wooden doors banded with bronze, half open to let in caravans. And here, pressed against the walls, the marketplace comes alive. The air hums with haggling voices, the shuffle of sandals, the bleating of goats, and above it all, the aroma of bread mixed with spices, herbs, and sweat. You move among the vendors, each with a stall crammed into whatever space they can claim. One baker has set up right by the gate, his reed mat piled with steaming loaves pulled fresh from a portable oven. He shouts out prices, waving his arms to draw the attention of traders, streaming in from the countryside. His voice carries above the din, promising loaves that are denser, fresher, fairer than his rivals. You almost want to buy one just for his enthusiasm. But prices here aren't simple. Bread isn't bought with neat coins, or at least not always. More often, it's traded for barley, oil, wool, or even labor. You watch a farmer slide a small bag of grain across the mat in exchange for 2 loaves. Nearby, a woman offers onions for bread. Currency in Babylon is flexible, and bread, of all things, is at the center of it. Historians still argue whether silver was truly the backbone of Babylonian exchange, or whether barter ruled daily life. Some tablets mention prices in silver down to tiny fractions of a shekel, but in practice most people here probably paid with grain or goods. It's one thing to write about silver in temple records. It's another thing entirely to have a chunk of the stuff rattling in your pocket. A quirky detail jumps out at you. Some stalls advertise their bread, with clay models, tiny baked loaves pressed into clay, hardened and set out like signs. It's almost like a 4,000-year-old version of plastic food models in a Japanese restaurant window. Shoppers could see what type of bread was on offer, even if the real loaves were still baking. You can't help but chuckle. Apparently, even in Babylon, advertising was a thing. The market hums with life. You pass a man loudly claiming his bread will outlast the season because he baked it with special herbs. A rival scoffs, accusing him of stretching the dough with too much chaff. A child sneaks close to a stall, snatches a crust, and vanishes into the crowd, leaving the baker cursing and shaking his fist. Some things never change. You stop at a corner where an elderly woman is trading not loaves but crumbs. She sells bowls of bread soaked in broth, ladled out steaming. For a copper shard, you get a filling meal. It's cheap, but it keeps the poor alive. She smiles toothlessly as she stirs, her pot bubbling, the smell oddly comforting. You realize this, too, is part of the bread economy, stretching even scraps to feed another mouth. The sound of the gate creaking open interrupts the chatter. A caravan lumbers through, donkeys laden with sacks of barley. Instantly, several scribes dart forward, styluses ready, recording quantities before the goods are even offloaded. Bread begins with grain, and the grain must be counted. Without numbers, the market collapses. You watch as traders argue with scribes about weight, each side tugging at the scales, trying to tip the balance in their favor. The whole scene feels strangely familiar, like a modern farmer's market, except with more shouting in Akkadian and fewer Instagram reels. As the sun climbs, the heat settles heavy over the square. The smell of bread mingles with sweat, and buyers fan themselves with reed fans. You drift past one final stall where a baker hands over a loaf so large it takes 2 hands to carry. The customer laughs, joking that this one will feed the gods themselves. The baker bows, winking, clearly pleased with the compliment, and as you step away, You realize the gate market is more than just commerce. It's a daily ritual, a meeting ground, a place where bread connects farmers, priests, traders, and laborers. Every loaf here carries stories of fields, silos, ovens, and scribes. Each bite is wrapped in the weight of arguments, blessings, and bargains. You walk toward the gate itself, looking back at the sea of vendors. Their voices still rising and falling in waves. Bread here is never silent. It's shouted, traded, weighed, argued, and carried off in baskets. And as you step into the shadow of the massive doors, you can't help but grin. For all the bureaucracy, bread in Babylon still has a beating heart, the chaos of the marketplace. Beyond the bustling gate market, your steps slow as you find yourself caught in an argument you've been hearing in echoes all morning. It isn't about whose bread is freshest or who sold the biggest loaf. It's about what bread is worth. You slip between two groups of men standing nose to nose, their voices sharp, their gestures wide. On one side, a merchant waves a strip of silver glinting in the sun. On the other, a farmer clutches a sack of barley, dust spilling out as his grip tightens. The debate is simple to state but impossible to resolve. Should bread be priced in silver, the shining metal that temples, hoard and traders covet, or should it be priced in barley, the grain every stomach depends on? You watch them spit words at each other, each convinced the other is blind to reason. Silver has the glamour of rarity. One glimmering shekel might buy loaves for an entire family for days, but it's scarce, drawn from distant mines, often controlled by elites. Barley, on the other hand, is everywhere grown in muddy fields, harvested by sweating farmers. Stored in silos that always seem suspiciously short, it's tangible, edible, and immediate. You can't chew silver, but you can chew barley still. Silver doesn't rot, doesn't get eaten by rats, and doesn't sprout inconveniently when left too long in storage. Historians still argue whether Babylon was primarily a silver economy or a barley economy. Clay tablets record prices in both, sometimes interchangeably. Was that loaf to Silas of barley or 1/50th of a shekel? The scribes wrote both, as though hedging their bets. Imagine keeping your savings account in dollars and potatoes, just to cover all bases. Here's a quirky fact. Some contracts actually set penalties depending on which standard was used. If you defaulted on a loan in silver, you owed one amount. In barley, a different one. Babylonian lawyers must have had a field day juggling grain sacks and silver nuggets in the courtroom, and you can almost hear the arguments, "Your Honor, my debtor agreed to pay in barley, not silver. That's why I delivered 3 cartloads of soggy grain instead of coins." In the marketplace, the dispute gets louder. The silver merchant shakes his gleaming metal, sneering that silver is eternal, pure, and recognized in every city from here to the Levant. The farmer jabs his sack, shouting that barley keeps people alive, while silver feeds no one but greedy traders. Around them, onlookers chuckle, nod, and occasionally shout their own opinions. One elderly man mutters that both sides miss the point that bread is really priceless. When you're hungry, you're tempted to clap for him, but you restrain yourself. Nearby, a scribe sits quietly, scratching both numbers into a clay tablet. He seems unbothered by the noise. For him, silver or barley, it doesn't matter as long as the tally is neat. His stylus taps steadily, carving wedges that will harden into history's most boring, yet most important, record of this very dispute. The sun glints off the silver strip again, and you notice how mesmerizing it is. It has a shine barley will never match, and yet, when a child tugs at her mother's tunic, whining for food, the mother doesn't reach for silver. She reaches for bread, warm and crumbly, handed over in exchange for a handful of grain. In that moment, the farmer looks smug. His argument has already won. Still, the truth is more complicated. Silver flowed through long-distance trade, linking Babylon to faraway lands. Without it, luxuries like tin for bronze or cedar wood wouldn't reach the city. Barley stayed close to home, grounding everyone in the soil and the oven. Both mattered, but in different ways. The debate wasn't about choosing one or the other, it was about power. Whoever controlled the measure of value controlled the city. You step back as the argument fizzles into muttering. The silver merchant stalks off, polishing his strip like it's a trophy. The farmer hefts his sack and heads toward the scribes, ready to have his grain weighed and recorded. The crowd disperses, still murmuring opinions. And you realize something. This tug-of-war between silver and barley never really ended. Even now, economists argue about gold standards, fiat money, and food security. Babylon's shouting match echoes down the centuries, louder than the clamor of the market itself. As you wander away, you glance at a loaf on a vendor's mat. Its crust is golden, cracked, and perfect. What's it worth? Silver, barley, or something else entirely? You can't help but smile. The answer depends on who's hungrier, the merchant's purse or the farmer's stomach. You wander from the marketplace into a quieter courtyard, where the air feels less frantic but no less important. Instead of merchants waving silver or farmers clutching sacks, you find young boys and teenagers hunched over clay tablets, their knees smeared with mud and streaks of dust. Their tunics are stained, their brows furrowed. Welcome to the scribal school, the workshop where the next generation of Babylonian accountants, bureaucrats, and bread-tallying experts cut their teeth. You pause in the doorway, leaning against a sun-warmed column. The room hums with the scratch-scratch of styluses pressing into clay. A stern instructor stalks the rows, a reed whip dangling casually from his hand. His gaze sweeps the students and everyone straightens a little. The mood is tense-like. A classroom where the teacher knows exactly who's been daydreaming. You hear a faint groan when one boy botches a sign. The teacher snatches the tablet, and smooths it clean with a wet hand. Again, he barks, and the poor boy starts over. The lesson of the day. Bread tallies. Rows of neat wedge marks representing loaves, rations, weights of barley. To us, it looks like an accountant's nightmare. To the Babylonians, it's survival. These marks mean workers get fed, priests receive offerings, and the city doesn't collapse under its own hunger. Every student here is training to be the human calculator who makes sure someone doesn't walk away with 3 loaves when they were only owed 2. Historians still argue whether scribal schools were attached mainly to temples, or whether private households ran them too. Some think only the elite could afford to train their sons as scribes. Others suggest the demand for bread talliers was so high that even modest families pushed their children into the trade. Either way, the clay-filled courtyard is a factory for bureaucrats. Each wedge stroke a step toward a future of sore wrists and long nights. One quirky detail stands out. Many tablets from these schools have been found with teachers' corrections, written over the students' mistakes, sometimes including little insults. Imagine handing in your math homework and finding sloppy or lazy scratched right across it. Ancient Babylonian teachers had zero chill. Some even drew exaggerated versions of the students' errors, cartoonishly large wedges just to rub it in. The poor apprentices probably wanted to crawl into the grain silos and hide. You notice how monotonous the exercises are. Bread loaf, barley measure. Bread loaf again. It's like writing "I will not chew gum" in class 100 times, except instead of gum it's a tally that feeds an empire. The boys' fingers are coated with clay dust, their styluses worn smooth. They shift restlessly, stretch their backs, then hunch forward again. The only break comes when one of them is told to run a tablet to the temple storehouse, a real life errand disguised as practice. A small boy, maybe no older than 10, glances up at you with clay streaks on his cheek. His eyes widen, then flick back to his tablet. He's carving a row of tiny loaves, each one like a fat oval. He presses carefully, tongue stuck out in concentration. His instructor leans over, nods once, and moves on. The boy grins. It's a small victory. But in this world, a neat row of bread symbols is the first step to respectability. You can't help but chuckle, imagining these kids 40 years later, sitting in a silo courtyard, arguing furiously about missing bushels while their apprentices scribble furiously behind them. The cycle never ends. Today's sweaty, clay-covered student is tomorrow's weary bureaucrat, sighing at the chaos of markets and temples. The atmosphere softens briefly when one of the older boys cracks a joke under his breath. A few snickers ripple through the class until the instructor slams his reed whip against a column. Silence falls instantly, broken only by the rhythmic scratching of styluses. You can almost hear the boys' thoughts. Anything is better than rewriting the bread column again. Still, there's a strange reverence in the work. Writing isn't casual here. Each wedge is a link in a chain stretching back generations. These boys know they're handling more than numbers, they're learning the very script of civilization. The bread tallies are practice, yes, but they're also part of something bigger, the keeping of order, the distribution of life itself. And yet, as you watch a student wipe sweat from his brow and smear his careful wedges into a mud-colored blur, you realize just how human it all is. The mistakes, the boredom, the small rebellions, they're timeless. If you've ever nodded off in class or doodled instead of taking notes, you'd fit right in here. The only difference is that instead of doodling in a notebook, you'd be carving crooked bread symbols into a slab of clay. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The instructor calls an end to the lesson. The boys set down their styluses, stretch and groan. Some tablets are tossed into a pile, destined to dry and crumble. Others are carefully stored. Proof of progress. The teacher claps his hands, dismissing them, and the courtyard empties in a flurry of chatter and relief. You linger a moment longer, the echoes of wedge marks still vivid in your mind. You realize you've just witnessed the backbone of Babylon's bread economy being forged. Not in the ovens, not in the silos, but in the careful training of scribes. Without them, the bread would vanish uncounted, the rations unpaid, the gods unfed. With them, civilization stays at least for a little while neatly pressed into rows of clay. The schoolyard quiet fades behind you, replaced by the shuffle of feet and the creak of carts. You drift into a broad avenue lined with mud-brick homes, where people carry baskets and clay jars toward a low, windowless building. The smell tells you what this is long before you see inside bread again, but not as fresh loaves to buy or eat. These are bread taxes, the civic duty every household shoulders in Babylon. You peer through the doorway. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of grain and smoke, mixed with the musk of too many bodies in one room. Families file past a long counter, setting down their contributions, flat rounds of barley bread, sometimes plain, sometimes flecked with seeds if they could spare them. Officials stand behind the counter, each with a clay tablet in hand, tallying. Carefully, they press styluses into wet clay as each loaf arrives, then nod curtly to the givers. It looks like a grim ritual, but also a familiar one. Everyone knows the rules. You bake, you deliver, you pay. The bread doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the temple, the city, or the king. Whether you're a farmer, a craftsman, or even a shopkeeper, part of your obligation is feeding the system itself. Think of it as the original property tax, except instead of writing a check once a year, you show up with bread under your arm every few days. Historians still argue whether these bread taxes were truly fair contributions or thinly disguised exploitation. On one hand, they funded public works, temple offerings, and city feasts. On the other hand, a poor family might be forced to surrender loaves they desperately needed in some records. There are even notes about punishments for underpayment, fines, additional labor, or, worst of all, being struck from the ration lists. Imagine being told, "Sorry, no bread for you this month. You didn't pay your bread tax last week." Bureaucracy with teeth. And yet, there's a quirky twist. Some households, instead of delivering finished loaves, handed over dough or grain, letting the officials bake it themselves. Archaeologists suspect this was partly to cut corners, partly to avoid blame if the loaf came out too small. Better to let the tax collector deal with the oven than risk being fined for a short crust. You can almost picture the grumpy official kneading dough himself, muttering about lazy taxpayers while sweat drips down his face inside the storehouse. Stacks of bread rise against the walls. The loaves aren't destined for cozy dinners. They'll be redistributed, some to temple rituals, some to the city guard, some to workers digging canals or building walls. The bread you labored over yesterday becomes someone else's rations today. Ownership is fleeting. Bread cycles faster than coins ever could. A woman in front of you sets down a basket of small, uneven loaves. She clutches her child's hand as the scribe counts 1, 2, 3, 4. He pauses at the fifth, frowning at its size. He mutters, presses a smaller mark into his tablet, and shakes his head. The woman bows her head but says nothing. The child squeezes her hand tighter, staring at the rejected loaf. For them, every crumb matters, but the system only cares about the mark on clay. You realize how ritualized this process has become. Families file in, hand over loaves, bow slightly, and file out. No one dares to joke here, unlike in the market. The atmosphere is too heavy. Bread in this place feels less like food and more like obedience. As you watch, a guard leans against the doorway, his spear tapping the ground lazily. His presence is a reminder. Pay your bread taxes or else you. Remember the arguments at the silos, the disputes over grain, the scribes in school learning how to tally. It all converges here, in this simple, repetitive ritual of surrendering loaves. And yet, life sneaks in even here. A young boy tries to nibble at the corner of a loaf before handing it over. His mother smacks his hand, whispering furiously. The scribe glances up, raises an eyebrow, but then smirks slightly before returning to his marks. Even within rigid systems, humanity wiggles through. As the sun lowers, the line dwindles. The storehouse is full now, smelling of warm bread stacked high. Each loaf a tiny brick in the city's invisible wall of taxes. You step back into the street, the weight of it pressing on you. Here, bread isn't just counted or traded, it's demanded. It's the currency of citizenship itself, the price of belonging in Babylon. The storehouse doors thud shut behind you, sealing in the scent of bread taxes, and your path carries you upward toward the palace quarter. The streets widen. Here, paved more carefully, lined with columns and carved reliefs. The air shifts to less sweat and dust, more incense and roasted meats. By the time you pass through the last archway, you're hit by a wall of sound, drums, flutes, and the roar of dozens of voices raised in cheer. Tonight, the king is hosting a feast, and the bakers of Babylon have outdone themselves. You drift into the great hall. It glows with torchlight reflected off gilded cups and bronze serving trays. Rows of long wooden tables stretch out, covered in embroidered cloth, and at the far end, beneath a canopy of painted stars, the king reclines on cushions, sipping beer. Through a long straw like he owns the world, which, at least in this city, he does. The bread here is unlike the flat rounds you saw in smoky ovens at dawn. These loaves glisten, brushed with honey and sesame seeds. Some are stuffed with dates, others shaped into elaborate braids. A tray passes you with loaves molded into the shapes of birds, wings folded neatly, their crusts golden brown. One servant balances a platter piled high with rolls so sweet they drip syrup onto the floor. You almost laugh. This is the Babylonian equivalent of a dessert buffet. A historian once joked that the royal bakers were the original celebrity chefs. Their recipes appear on tablets, noting not just barley and water, but spices, herbs, and sweeteners that ordinary workers rarely tasted. You spot one loaf sprinkled with coriander, another dusted with crushed garlic. If you squint, you could almost mistake it for a modern bread basket at a fancy restaurant, except here, the bread doubles as propaganda. Each honey-glazed loaf whispers, "Look how rich the king is. Look how generous." Historians still argue whether these feasts were true celebrations or political theater. Were the loaves meant to fill bellies or to display power? Probably both. When hundreds of nobles and officials eat together, laughing and boasting, they reinforce the king's authority with every bite. Bread at these tables is less about calories and more about loyalty. You can't help but notice the contrast. Just this morning, workers stood in line for coarse barley discs, some barely big enough to share. Now, a noble tosses half a sweet roll to the floor, uninterested, and a servant rushes to sweep it away. The imbalance is stark, yet almost invisible to the crowd inside. Here, abundance is expected, even demanded. There's a quirky tidbit hidden. In all this decadence, some texts describe loaves baked in molds shaped like gods, or mythical creatures set out at feasts for ritual and decoration. Imagine biting into a loaf shaped like a lion's head, half sacred symbol, half novelty dinner roll. You picture a guest nervously chewing the lion's ear, wondering if the gods would take offense. The music swells and dancers whirl between the tables, scattering petals and laughter. Servants refill cups, carry more platters, and keep the bread flowing. You realize how important bakers are here. A burnt loaf might not just embarrass a cook, it could insult a king, anger a guest. Even sour alliances. Royal bakers probably worked under more pressure than modern contestants on cooking shows, fail the feast. And you wouldn't just be eliminated, you might be eliminated permanently. As you watch the nobles tear into their loaves, crumbs scattering across embroidered cloth, you notice something subtle. The scribes are here too, lurking along the walls with their tablets. They're not eating, they're recording every loaf baked, every platter served, every ingredient accounted for, because even in the glow of a royal feast, Babylon still runs on numbers. If a farmer delivered a sack of sesame seeds for the king's table, the record must prove it. Nothing, not even honey bread for courtiers, escapes the clay stylus. The feast stretches on. Guests grow louder, drunk on beer and pride. Loaves are torn apart, dipped into bowls of stew, and passed along the tables. You watch as the king himself takes a roll shaped like the moon, lifts it toward the ceiling and smiles. Is it worship? Or is it theatre? Hard to say, but the hall erupts in cheers. As if a loaf of bread had just guaranteed the empire's future, you step back, the heat of the hall pressing against you. The smell of honey and spices clings to your nose, almost dizzying after the sour barley of the ration lines. Here, bread is no longer survival. It is spectacle, luxury, a symbol of divine favor. And yet, deep down, you know it comes from the same grain, the same silos, the same sweaty bakers at dawn. The difference is who eats and why daughters you leave the feast behind. The laughter fading, you can't shake the thought. In Babylon, bread is everywhere, but never equal. For some, it is wages, for others, taxes. For the king and his nobles, it is a golden symbol piled high on tables. And through it all, someone is always counting. The echoes of the royal feast linger in your ears, music, laughter, and the snap of bread crusts torn carelessly by jeweled fingers. But as you leave the palace quarter and wander back toward the city's working districts, the tone shifts completely. The air is heavier here, tinged with sweat, clay dust, and the sharp tang of sun-baked mud brick. Instead of nobles reclining on cushions, you find long lines of weary men bricklayers, canal diggers, soldiers waiting patiently under the gaze of guards. They're not here for entertainment. They're here to be paid. And payment, of course, doesn't come in coins jingling in leather purses. It comes in bread. You drift closer and see how organized it is, almost like an assembly line. Workers shuffle forward one by one. Each presents a token or has their name checked against a clay tablet. An official nods, gestures to a pile of loaves, and hands over the day's ration. Sometimes it's to coarse barley discs, sometimes 3, depending on rank or task. Alongside the bread comes a jug of beer, cloudy and frothing, passed like clockwork from one worker to the next. You watch a soldier receive his ration, 3 loaves and a larger jug. He smirks at the bricklayer beside him, bragging about combat. Pay. The bricklayer rolls his eyes, clutching his smaller ration tightly. They both know bread is survival, and more bread means more strength to face tomorrow's toil. Historians still argue whether these wages were enough to sustain workers, or deliberately kept them hungry to ensure obedience. The records say loaves and a jug of beer per day was standard. But anyone who's lifted stones or dug ditches under a blazing Mesopotamian sun would tell you that's barely enough. Maybe the scarcity was a way to keep workers dependent, always returning to the ration lines, always bound to the system. Still, there's a quirky warmth in the ritual. Some workers trade loaves among themselves, swapping one plain bread for a sweeter onion loaf or saving an extra to bring home. A few tuck their loaves into baskets lined with cloth, carrying them back to families who wait eagerly. Others tear a chunk off immediately, dunk it into the beer, and devour it before even leaving the line. You can hear the muffled crunch of crusts and the soft sighs of relief as hungry stomachs quiet. The scribes are here too, as always. Their knees are caked with clay dust, tablets stacked beside them like heavy bricks. They mark every transaction, pressing tiny wedge symbols that declare, "This man has been fed. This worker has been paid." You imagine what would happen. If a name was missed, would the worker go hungry? Would he shout, protest, maybe riot? The scribe's stylus is as sharp as a soldier's spear, only wielded more quietly. You lean against a wall and watch the flow of rations. One young man receives his bread, bows slightly to the official, and then before biting into it presses the loaf to his forehead, a small gesture of gratitude. Maybe habit, maybe superstition. Bread isn't just food, it's luck, survival, even prayer. You wonder if anyone in the palace feasts would think to treat their loaves with such reverence. A whisper of rebellion runs through the line. A worker mutters that his ration is smaller than last week's. Another nods, grumbling, about a missing jug of beer. Voices rise, but a guard slams his spear but against the ground, silencing the complaints. The bread still flows, but the tension is thick. You realize how fragile the system is. Cut a few rations and loyalty crumbles. Historians still argue whether bread shortages directly sparked uprisings. Some say yes, revolts often began not with swords but with empty stomachs. A quirky anecdote comes to mind. One text records a baker fined because his loaves for soldiers were too small. Imagine standing before an official while he weighs your bread and declares it unfit for war. The baker must have cursed under his breath, knowing his short crust had just become a state offense. The sun dips lower, painting long shadows across the ration lines. The last workers shuffle forward, clutching their loaves like treasure. Some leave smiling faintly, others scowling, but all leave fed at least for today. The scribes pack up their tablets. The officials close the storage doors and the guards. Relax, another day's wages distributed, another cycle complete. You walk away slowly, the murmurs of workers fading behind you. In the palace, bread was abundance, a spectacle. Here, bread is survival measured carefully, handed out with the weight of authority. Yet both scenes are connected to halves of the same system. The king's sweet rolls and the workers' barley. Discs come from the same grain, tallied by the same scribes, baked by the same hands. The difference is in who gets what and how much. The ration lines dissolve into the dusk, but you notice a cluster of officials lingering near the storage house. They're not carrying loaves in baskets or sipping beer jugs. They're hunched, over clay tablets spread across a reed mat. Their stylus is stabbing methodically. You drift closer, and there it is, the heartbeat of the system, the seal. One man kneels, rolling a small carved cylinder across a fresh clay lump. The imprint left behind is intricate rows of tiny figures, gods standing with raised hands, animals in profile and wedge-like inscriptions squeezed into the margins. He lifts it carefully, nods and presses it onto another tablet. One by one, the officials add their own marks. Each seal is unique, like a signature, and together they transform these tablets from mere tallies into official records. The process is almost ritualistic. Bread distributed to workers earlier in the day is now immortalized in clay. To loaves to a bricklayer. 3 loaves and a jug of beer to a soldier. 1 loaf withheld as punishment. Each transaction sealed, confirmed, locked in place like a contract no one can deny. Without the seal, the marks are just scratches. With it, they become law. Historians still argue about how much power this cylinder seals carried. Were they simply bureaucratic stamps, or did they also serve as amulets of divine authority? Some seals depict gods watching the transaction as if saying, "We saw you and we approve." Imagine needing both your boss's approval and divine, consigning just to hand over a loaf. A quirky detail. Some seals were so finely carved they doubled as jewelry. Officials wore them on cords around their necks, spinning them between their fingers like status symbols. You could almost hear one boasting, "Check out my new seal imported lapis lazuli, carved with a lion. Yours still has chipped edges?" Shame! Bureaucrats flexing hasn't changed much in the 1,000 years. As the clay hardens in the warm evening air. You realize how permanent this all is. Bread itself disappears, quickly eaten, digested, gone. But the record of bread lingers for millennia. Archaeologists dig these tablets up today, brushing off dirt to read the tally of loaves given to soldiers who've been dust for ages. Those forgotten men's stomachs are long empty, but their rations live on in clay. The scene before you is quiet but heavy. The officials whisper, double-checking numbers. One smooths a tablet over and starts again, grumbling about inconsistent tallies. Another frowns at a mark, claiming it's ambiguous, and they debate whether it means 3 loaves or 2.5. Yes, half loaves were a thing because why let fractions of bread escape the mouth? You smile, imagining some poor worker being handed a loaf sliced awkwardly in half because the tablet demanded it. The guards keep watch while the scribes seal their work. Bread wages might seem humble, but they represent loyalty, labor, and survival. To falsify a tally, to break a seal, was more than theft, it was betrayal. Punishments could be harsh. Some records hint at bakers or officials fined heavily, or worse, barred from future service. You imagine the fear of a scribe caught erasing a wedge, the panic as he tries to smooth the clay before it dries. The stylus could make or break her life. The cylinder seal rolls again, leaving its delicate trail of gods and beasts across the clay. The official sighs, satisfied, and hands the tablet to an assistant, who carries it carefully into the archives. There, in dim silence, thousands of such tablets wait in neat rows, stacked like bricks. Each one holds numbers that once fed a soldier, once kept a worker alive. Together, they are the city's hidden skeleton, the framework that keeps Babylon. A bright dot, and as you watch, you feel a strange shift in perspective. To you, it's a boring record, just numbers and stamps, but to the Babylonians, it's sacred. Bread was fleeting, but breadmouth was eternal. The seal made it so. You step back into the cooling night, listening to the faint scrape of styluses still at work. The officials murmur on, sealing their day's bread into permanence. Tomorrow, new loaves will be baked, new rations handed out, new arguments started. But tonight, the clay hardens, the seals dry, and the city sleeps knowing its bread has been officially counted, marked, and blessed with divine approval. The night passes, and when you step into the streets again, the city feels strangely subdued. The market chatter is quieter, the smell of baking bread thinner in the air. You follow the murmurs of the crowd and soon realize why. The river has not flooded as it should. Canals are cracked and dry, fields lie parched. Barley stalks that should be standing tall are stunted, yellow, brittle. The loaves that fed the palace, the priests, the soldiers, the workers, all of them now grow scarce. You drift among families gathered at the market, their baskets nearly empty. Instead of piled mats of bread, stalls display only a few loaves, each guarded like treasure. Prices spike, whispers float around, the silos are low. The temple rations will be cut. A woman clutches her child, murmuring that the gods must be angry, and maybe that's true after all. When the river fails, so does the city. Historians still argue whether Babylon's famines were caused mainly by poor irrigation management or by natural drought cycles. Some point to evidence of salinization fields over-irrigated until the soil itself turned white with salt, choking the crops. Others argue that unpredictable floods doomed entire harvests, regardless of human effort. Either way, the result is the same: fewer loaves, more desperation. And here's the quirky, almost absurd detail. Some families made loaves that mixed barley with filigrane reeds, weeds, even powdered clay just to stretch what little grain they had. Archaeologists have actually found loaves with bits of inedible grit baked inside. You can imagine biting into one of those and chipping a tooth, muttering that even hunger wasn't worth this. But when starvation lurks, even clay bread is better than nothing. The temple storehouse reflects the crisis too. You peek inside and see shelves half bare, stacks of bread dwindling. Officials argue, voices sharp, styluses stabbing clay with frustration. One insists that rations must be cut in half to survive the season. Another says priests must still receive full offerings or the gods will abandon the city. It's not just an economic crisis, it's spiritual. Bread is supposed to bind the people to their gods. Without it, both hunger and doubt spread. The ration lines grow tense. Men shuffle forward, their loaves smaller than yesterday's, their beer jugs thinner. A soldier scowls, muttering that he can't fight on crumbs. A bricklayer curses, staring at his half-loaf, too angry to speak. The guards tap their spears nervously, sensing the crowd's unrest. You can feel it in the air. Bread shortages ignite, tempers faster than speeches or decrees. And then there's the shadow economy. You hear rumors of bakers hiding loaves, of officials pocketing grain, of black market bread sold secretly at night. Someone whispers that a single honey loaf now costs what used to buy an entire sack of barley. Bread, once mundane, becomes luxury. Those who have it wield power, those who don't face despair. One evening, you slip down an alley and see a family, huddled around a single loaf, breaking it into pieces so tiny each person's share barely covers a palm. The father smiles bravely, insisting it's enough. The children chew slowly, making it last. The mother stares at the crust in her hand, then quietly sets it aside for the youngest child. You feel the weight of it. Bread here isn't just currency or tax. It is love, sacrifice, survival. Historians still argue whether famine led directly to Babylon's decline, or whether the empire weathered the shortages with resilience. But in moments like this, the answer feels less important than the scene itself. A city built on bread trembling. Whenever the loaves run thin as the sun sinks, you hear a priest chanting in the distance, begging the gods for floods, rain, renewal. His voice cracks, desperate, echoing over empty fields. And you wonder if the gods are listening or if, like the rest of Babylon, they too are hungry. The dry season lingers, but Babylon is nothing if not inventive, with fewer loaves to go around. The question becomes not just how to bake bread, but how to keep it from spoiling. You follow a group of bakers through narrow alleys until they duck into a workshop, tucked behind a market stall. Inside, the air is thick with the earthy smell of clay and smoke. The room is crowded with jars tall, squat, sealed with wax or mud. Each holds a secret, bread stored for days, maybe weeks, past the point it should have crumbled away. One baker pries open a jar. A faint hiss escapes, along with a musty scent that makes you wrinkle your nose. He grins, pulls out a small round loaf and brushes off crumbs of dried clay. It's hard as a stone, but still edible after a quick soak in water or beer. This is one of Babylon's storage tricks, sealing loaves in clay or jars to lock out air and pests. Not delicious, but when you're hungry, soft crusts are less important than calories. Another baker shows off a different technique. He slathers a loaf in sesame oil before sealing it. The sheen hardens into a protective coat, warding off mold. Think of it as the world's earliest cling wrap, except edible, fragrant, and prone to dripping down your chin if you bite too fast. He winks at you, clearly proud of the innovation. Historians still argue whether Babylonians actually baked preservative loaves, specifically for storage, or whether most of these tricks were desperate improvisations during shortages. Some claim texts describing sealed bread were part of temple ration systems. Others think they were household hacks passed quietly among families. The debate lingers, much like the smell of stale grain in this workshop. A quirky tidbit: certain loaves were dried deliberately until they were as hard as bricks, then stacked in piles like supplies for a siege. Soldiers on long campaigns would soak them in water or beer before eating, softening them just enough to chew. You imagine biting into one without soaking it first, your teeth protesting loudly, your scribe recording your dental expenses on a clay tablet. The workshop hums with activity. A woman kneads dough mixed with dates, the sugar acting as a natural preservative. Another experiments with salt, rubbing it into the crust before baking. They chatter as they work, trading tips. The way modern bakers swap recipes on forums. You catch phrases like 3 days longer and mold-free for a week. Their voices tinged with both pride and desperation. Of course, not all tricks work. In the corner, a boy opens a poorly sealed jar and immediately gags. The loaf inside is covered in a green fuzz that looks suspiciously familiar. Mold, ancient and modern, has always been the same enemy. The boy's mother scolds him for wasting grain, tossing the ruined loaf onto a growing pile of rejects. Even in Babylon, not every experiment succeeds. You wander past the jars and notice how careful the bakers are with sealing. Some use wax. Others press clay stoppers marked with cylinder seals. The seals serve two purposes: proof of ownership and a warning not to tamper. You imagine a family arguing over whether a loaf inside a sealed jar belongs to them or their neighbor. In the end, the seal decides. A loaf with the wrong mark might as well be off limits. No matter how hungry you are, the bakers here speak softly, but their work is crucial. Without these tricks, bread vanishes in a day or two, especially in Babylon's heat. With them, loaves can last long enough to bridge the gap between harvests, or at least until the next ration delivery. These jars of sealed bread are lifelines, the ancient equivalent of canned goods in your pantry. And yet, there's something touching in how ordinary it all feels. A mother wrapping loaves for her children's future meals. A soldier tucking rock-hard bread into a pack for the road. A baker experimenting with sesame oil the way someone today might test a new recipe. Beneath the clay dust and smoke, it's just people trying to stretch food a little further, to outsmart hunger for one more day dot as you step back into the alley. The workshop smells cling to you: oil, smoke, a hint of mold. The city hums quietly around you, its survival balanced on tricks sealed in clay jars. Bread, fleeting as always, is given a second life here. Not glamorous, not sweet, but stubborn, just like Babylon itself. The alleyways grow narrower, and soon you find yourself in a district that hums with a different kind of energy. Not the solemn tally of taxes or the tense ration lines, but the warm chatter of neighborhood ovens. Here, bread isn't counted or sealed away. It's celebrated, experimented with, enjoyed. The smell alone tells you this isn't the coarse barley bread of the workers, or the honey loaves of the palace. It's something in between, flavored, playful, personal. You duck into a small courtyard where 3 women kneel at low tables, each shaping dough into curious forms. One flattens her round into a thin disc and sprinkles crushed onion across the top. Another folds her dough around chopped dates, pinching it shut like a little pouch. The third pats sesame seeds into a loaf before slapping it into a hot dome. Oven, they laugh, share scraps, taste each other's mixtures. Bread here is less about obedience and more about creativity. You lean in and notice that the variations are endless. Some loaves are flat and chewy, baked quickly against clay walls. Others puff into thick, cake-like rounds. A few are glazed with honey or date syrup, dripping and sticky, reserved for special occasions. You realize you've stumbled into the equivalent of a Mesopotamian recipe swap, where every household has its secret twist. Historians still argue whether these recipe variations were mostly festival treats, or everyday staples for those who could afford them. The tablets mention both humble ration loaves and luxury cakes, but it's not always clear who ate which or how often. Was the onion loaf a worker's indulgence after saving scraps, or a dish meant for wealthier tables? The line blurs, and you find yourself wondering how many unrecorded recipes are lost to time. A quirky tidbit surfaces in your thoughts. One surviving tablet lists instructions for a kind of sweet cake made from barley, dates, and butter. It reads less like a recipe and more like an accountant's note: X measures barley, X measures dates, but the outcome sounds suspiciously like an early dessert. You imagine some baker proudly presenting it at a feast, the first person in history to say, "Try this, it's my special recipe." You watch as one woman pulls her onion loaf from the oven. Steam rises in curls, carrying a savory smell that makes your stomach growl. She tears it open, the crust crackling, the inside soft and dotted with green flecks. She offers a piece to her neighbor, who laughs and says it's too salty. They argue lightly, teasing, each claiming her recipe is better. It's a scene you'd recognize instantly, friends bantering over who baked the best bread. For 1,000 years later, the argument continues in kitchens everywhere. Children dart through the courtyard, snatching crumbs from the cooling trays. A boy dips his piece into a jug of beer, making a face as the bitterness hits his tongue. His mother smacks his arm gently, telling him to stick with water. The women laugh, and the boy sulks before sneaking another bite. Life pulses here, ordinary and warm, bound by loaves but not controlled by them. The contrast strikes you. In the palace, bread was spectacle. In the storehouse, it was obligation. Here in the courtyard, it is joy. The difference is subtle but profound. Bread doesn't just sustain, it delights. It becomes an art form, a way to connect, to experiment, to turn survival into celebration. As the evening deepens, neighbors wander in carrying trays. Someone brings flatbreads dusted with coriander. Another carries round cakes baked with cheese. The courtyard transforms into a feast of its own, not royal, not sacred, but deeply human. No scribes tally the loaves here, no officials press seals. The bread is shared, broken, passed hand to hand. You can't help but grin at the thought. These neighborhood bakers, laughing and experimenting, were the real inventors of culinary tradition. Their recipes never made it into the official records, but they survived in gestures, in tastes, in the memory of families who kept baking them generation after generation. And in that way, these simple onion loaves and date cakes might have shaped history more than the king's golden rolls ever did. The night air fills with laughter and the crackle of bread crusts breaking. The courtyard glows with torchlight, and the smell of sweet cakes mingles with savory onions. You lean back against a wall, belly full, heart warm, realizing that in Babylon, bread was more than ration or tax. It was creativity, love, and the quiet joy of eating something delicious with people who mattered. The laughter from the courtyard fades as you slip back into the winding lanes, where the city feels smaller, more intimate. Here, there are no priests chanting blessings over honey loaves, no scribes stamping clay with divine seals. Instead, you stumble upon something homier, the smell of smoke, rising from dozens of little domes tucked against the walls of family courtyards. These are the household ovens, the true backbone of Babylon's bread culture. You duck into one courtyard where a family is already at work. The oven itself is nothing fancy, just a clay dome. Shaped like an upside-down pot, its surface cracked. With heat, the fire burns inside, glowing orange through a small opening at the bottom. A woman crouches nearby, kneading dough on a flat stone, her hands moving with practiced rhythm. The slap-slap of dough against her palms is steady, like the beat of a drum. Beside her, a child sprinkles flour, really just finely ground barley, across the stone. Giggling when a puff of dust coats his nose, his mother shoos him away, but not before smiling. This isn't ritual or duty. It's daily life, ordinary and vital. Every family in the city depends on their oven, as important as a roof over their heads. You watch as she shapes the dough into discs and presses them against the inside wall of the oven. The bread clings, sizzling instantly. The smell fills the courtyard, nutty, toasty, with just a hint of smoke. A few minutes later, she reaches in with a hook, peeling off the baked rounds. The crust is blistered, the center soft. She sets them in a pile while her husband tends the fire, feeding it with dried reeds. This is teamwork, ancient and eternal. Historians still argue whether these ovens belonged exclusively to families or if some were shared by clusters of households. Archaeological digs show both private ovens tucked into homes and larger communal ovens in courtyards where neighbors baked side by side. Either way, the oven was a constant, the heart of the home, a place where warmth and food always radiated. Here's a quirky touch. Some families pressed patterns into their loaves before baking, little dots, crosses, or simple lines, not for decoration, but for identification. Imagine the families baking together in the same oven, pulling out 30 loaves and trying to figure out whose was whose. A pattern pressed with a fingertip solved the problem, like the world's earliest brand logos. You smile, imagining one father bragging that his double-cross pattern loaf was clearly superior to his neighbor's boring dots. The evening meal comes together around the oven. A pot of lentils bubbles nearby, the bread rounds serving as both spoon and plate. The children tear their pieces, dipping and chewing noisily, their laughter echoing. The parents eat slower, savoring, eyes half closed in relief after a day's labor. There's no grand feast here, no silver or honey, just the quiet satisfaction of full stomachs. And yet, there's a sacredness too. Before eating, the father sets aside one small piece of bread on the edge of the hearth, a token, an offering, maybe to the household gods. Bread, even here, carries meaning beyond hunger. It's gratitude made tangible. You notice how fragile this whole setup is. If the oven cracks, the family is in trouble. If the grain runs short, the fire goes cold. But when it works, it binds the family together. The oven is a hearth, a center, a symbol of continuity. Every loaf pulled from it ties them to generations past and future. The scene is cozy, but it isn't without its comic notes. One child burns his fingers trying to grab a hot loaf too soon. He yelps, sticks his hand in a jug of water, and everyone bursts into laughter. Even as his mother scolds him, another loaf slips from the wall and lands in the fire, blackening. Instantly, the father fishes it out, shrugs, and eats it anyway, declaring it extra smoky. Some jokes never go stale. As the stars prick the sky above Babylon, the courtyard quiets. The fire dies down to embers. The family stacks tomorrow's bread into a basket lined with cloth, covering it carefully. The oven cools, ready to blaze. Again with the dawn, you step out into the night, the scent of baked bread clinging to your hair and clothes, realizing that while temples, palaces, and markets may dominate the records, it's these little domes, these humble household ovens that truly kept Babylon alive. The city has grown quieter, the sky above sprinkled with faint stars. But you follow another sound, low chanting, broken by coughs and murmurs. It leads you into a dim courtyard, where a healer sits surrounded by jars and bowls, instead of incense or herbs. What catches your eye first is the bread. Yes, bread again. But this time it's not stacked for eating or sealed for storage. It's crumbled into powders, soaked into pastes, or scorched into blackened crusts. Welcome to the strange world of Babylonian bread. As medicine. The healer, a weary man with eyes like tired coals, dips a spoon into a bowl of soggy crumbs and presses it into the hand of a woman. She looks skeptical but obedient, lifting it to her lips as he insists it will cure her fever. Across the courtyard, another patient sits with bread poultices strapped to his leg, the crusts bound with linen like makeshift bandages. You tilt your head. Apparently, in Babylon, bread wasn't only food or wages, it was therapy. One tablet even mentions bread soaked in beer prescribed for stomach ailments. You can't help but grin. Was that really a cure, or just an excuse to enjoy a tipsy snack under doctor's orders? Imagine someone coughing, only to be told, take 2 loaves in beer and call me in the morning. Medical science has come a long way, but you'd still see people lining up for that prescription. Historians still argue how effective these bread remedies actually were. Some suggest they offered genuine nutrition during sickness, keeping patients alive when appetite failed. Others point out that many treatments were probably symbolic. Bread as a sacred substance, carrying divine power into the body. Was the bread healing the patient, or was it the faith behind it? The debate lingers. As chewy as a stale crust, quirky detail. In one text, bread ash burned loaves ground into powder was mixed with oils and smeared onto wounds. The theory was that the carbonized crumbs drew out infection. It sounds strange, but when you remember modern activated charcoal, suddenly the Babylonians don't seem entirely off track. Still, you'd hesitate before letting someone rub burnt bread on your cut. You watch the healer grind crumbs with a stone pestle, his movements steady, muttering incantations under his breath. He isn't just making medicine, he's invoking the gods, blending food and faith into one treatment. Patients bow their heads, trusting him, desperate for relief. Some clutch loaves tightly in their hands, as if holding bread itself could draw sickness away. The air smells odd here, not the warm comfort of baking, but the sour tang of ferment, the bitterness of scorched grain. It's less appetizing, more clinical. The courtyard is quieter too, filled with the rustle of cloth and the occasional groan of someone ill. Bread, once a delight, here becomes a last hope. A boy coughs harshly, and his mother rushes forward with a small loaf dipped in honey, pressing it to his lips. He sucks weakly, the the sweetness easing his throat. You realize this isn't so far from modern remedies, honey lozenges, comfort food for the sick. Maybe bread, coated with sugar and belief, really did make the suffering easier to bear. The healer pauses, lifts a particularly blackened crust and examines it. He mutters about evil spirits lodged in the bread. The patient beside him looks alarmed, but he reassures her by tossing the crust into the fire. The flames leap, and the healer nods solemnly. Bread here isn't just medicine, it's also diagnosis, omen, even exorcism. You step back into the shadows, struck by how flexible bread has become in Babylonian life. It is tax, wage, offering, luxury, storage, and now cure. Always counted, always present, always reinterpreted. The line between nourishment and healing blurs. Whether or not the bread actually banished fevers, it gave people something to hold on to. A physical symbol of care in a world that often felt fragile and unpredictable. And maybe that's the point. When sickness loomed and hope ran thin, even the simplest loaf could feel like a lifeline. Crumbled, burned, soaked, or sweetened, it wasn't just bread anymore. It was belief baked into a remedy, a prayer you could swallow. The smoky courtyard of the healer fades behind you, and soon you're drawn by a sharper sound, voices raised, not in prayer this time, but in argument. You follow the echoes into a narrow hall where a group of men stand before a seated judge. The air smells of clay and sweat, but the center of attention isn't weapons, land, or livestock. It's bread. Loaves, stacked in baskets at the judge's feet, are at the heart of a legal dispute. One baker stands trembling, his tunic flour-stained, his voice cracking as he insists he bake the loaves to the correct size. Across from him, a soldier jabs a finger, shouting that the loaves he received were smaller than the rations promised. The judge frowns, listening carefully while a scribe scratches notes into a tablet at his side. Bread here is not just food, it's evidence. The scene is almost comical, grown men squabbling over crusts and crumbs. But the tension is deadly serious. If the baker cheated, he's guilty of shorting the king's soldiers. If the soldier lied, he risks punishment for slandering a tradesman. Neither option is safe. You feel the weight of it. Bread isn't trivial when it's wages, tax, or sacred offering. It's the city's lifeblood, and miscounting it is practically treason. Historians still argue whether these disputes were common or only recorded. Because they were exceptional, some tablets show fines for bakers who used poor quality grain or underbaked their loaves. Others record soldiers punished for exaggerating their shortages. The truth is muddy, as it always is when food, pride, and bureaucracy collide. Here's a quirky detail. One surviving tablet actually describes loaves not of full measure, complete with the punishment extra loaves owed plus a fine in silver. You can almost picture the judge slapping the table and declaring, "Your bread is too short. Pay up. Bread shrinkflation, Babylonian edition." The judge in front of you inspects one of the loaves from the basket, turning it over in his hands. He measures it against a clay mold kept nearby. Yes, they had bread molds to ensure standard sizes. Much like weight stones for silver, the loaf is indeed smaller, its crust thinner, its weight lighter. The judge's face hardens. The baker swallows, his hands shaking. The scribe scribbles faster, stylus stabbing clay like a dagger. The verdict comes swiftly. The baker is fined. Ordered to deliver twice the number of loaves tomorrow, each one measured against the official mold. The soldier smirks, vindicated. But you catch a flicker of worry because now all bakers will be watched more closely, and ration lines may slow. One man's cheating or one judge's suspicion ripples through the entire system. You step outside the hall into the courtyard where other cases are waiting. A woman clutches a burnt loaf, accusing her neighbor of delivering it instead of the fresh one promised in a trade. A priest complains that temple offerings arrived late and stale. Another baker protests that his grain was infested, not his fault, but he's still held liable. Each case spins from the same truth. Bread is never just bread here. It's contract currency. And Lord, the crowd mutters, some sympathetic, others jeering. A boy whispers to his friend that his father once saw a baker whipped for watering down dough. The friend's eyes widen. Fear and gossip swirl through the air as much as flour ever did, and you can't help but think how familiar it feels. Even today, lawsuits over short waits, mislabeled food and price disputes fill courtrooms. In Babylon, the difference was scale. One missing loaf could mean hunger, not just annoyance. Still, the principle is timeless. Cheat the customer, face the law. As the cases roll on, the sun slants low, gilding the mud brick walls. The judge's voice drones. The scribe's styluses scratch, and the smell of bread lingers in the courtyard. Like an uninvited witness, you step away, the noise fading behind you, carrying with you a simple lesson etched in clay and crust. In Babylon, even a loaf of bread could land you in court. The disputes fade into the evening, but Babylon never really sleeps. You wander through streets where torches flicker, and suddenly your attention lifts skyward. On rooftops and temple terraces, priests gather, their robes fluttering in the warm breeze. They aren't looking at bread or loaves or scribal tablets. They're staring at the stars. And oddly enough, those same stars will tell them when to bake tomorrow's bread. You climb a narrow stair to the top of a ziggurat where a group of astrologer priests kneel. Beside clay charts, they point upward, tracing constellations with their fingers. The star of Ishtar rises before dawn. One murmurs, so the ovens must be lit early. Another nods, noting the position of Jupiter, linking it to the prosperity of grain harvests. For them, the heavens dictate not just omens of war or peace, but also the humdrum rhythm of baking schedules. It sounds absurd, but timing mattered in Babylon. Bread baking was sensitive, too early, and loaves cooled before distribution, too late, and ration lines turned restless. So why not let the stars decide? After all, if the gods wrote the sky, who better to set your kitchen timer? Historians still argue how much astronomy truly influenced daily bread schedules, versus being layered on afterward as ritual justification. Some claim priests exaggerated their control, weaving star lore into routines that were already practical. Others insist the alignment of Venus or the moon genuinely dictated when temple bakers fired their ovens. The truth probably lies somewhere between science, superstition, and convenience. And here's the quirky part. One surviving tablet actually links lunar phases to beer brewing times. If the moon could dictate beer, why not bread? Imagine being a baker muttering, "Sorry, boss, can't light the oven yet, Saturn hasn't risen." You'd either get laughed out of the bakery or promoted to head priest. You stand quietly, watching the priests scratch calculations into clay. Each mark translates the sky into numbers, the cosmos into loaves. Below, in the city, families knead dough by firelight, trusting that tomorrow's bread will bake on schedule. Up here, the stars gleam coldly, utterly indifferent, yet somehow woven into the fate of every loaf. One priest raises his arms and chants. Another takes a stylus and presses a wedge into clay, recording the observation. You realize you're seeing bureaucracy married to astronomy, bread anchored to the heavens. By the tip of a reed, it's oddly beautiful in a boring, math-heavy way. The city sleeps under this watch. Workers curl on reed mats, stomachs half full. Guards pace the walls, nibbling their ration loaves. And high above, a priest marks the moment when the constellation rises, whispering that the ovens will burn just before dawn. It's as though bread itself has become part of the stars' eternal dance. Another cycle mapped across heaven and earth-alike. You take a deep breath. The night air is cooler up here, carrying the smell of clay and faint ash from the city ovens below. For a moment, the boundaries blur between bread and sky, between hunger and ritual, between daily life and cosmic order. The stars glitter, the priests chant, and somewhere a baker stirs, ready to light the fire at exactly the right celestial moment. You descend from the ziggurat steps, your sandals scraping against cool stone, and slip back into the winding lanes. The city has hushed now, but in small courtyards and dim corners, stories are still being told. You follow the soft lilt of a grandmother's voice, weaving tales to a circle of drowsy children. And though her words meander through gods, kings, and monsters, you realize the common thread is bread, always bread. She tells of a loaf shaped like a crescent moon, baked during festivals to ensure luck for the coming harvest. She whispers, of round loaves given to brides on their wedding day, symbols of fertility and abundance. Another story warns that if your bread cracks in the oven, it means misfortune is near. The children gasp, staring wide-eyed at the crackling fire as though their very future hides in tomorrow's crust. Folklore seeps into every loaf. One tale insists that if you share the first bite of bread with a neighbor, you'll never go hungry. Another warns that dropping a loaf is a bad omen unless you immediately sprinkle salt on it. Superstitions cling to crumbs the way seeds cling to dough. You chuckle softly because even now, people blow on fallen bread before eating it, or insist on breaking bread with both hands instead of cutting it with a knife. Some traditions never stale. Historians still argue how much of this folklore was religion in disguise versus simple cultural habit. Were bread shapes and omens direct offerings to the gods, or just comforting rituals passed down like family recipes? The line bears as it often does in Babylon, where divine power and daily bread are always needed together. Here's a quirky tidbit. One fragmentary text hints that bakers sometimes shaped loaves, like animals, turtles, fish, even lions, not just for offerings, but as little charms against bad luck. Imagine nibbling on a turtle-shaped loaf before a journey, hoping it would make your steps steady, or breaking apart a lion loaf to draw courage. It sounds whimsical, but for the Babylonians, these shapes carried weight. Bread was story, symbol, spell. You linger by the fire as the grandmother finishes her tale. She points to the flames, warning that if the smoke rises straight, the bread tomorrow will bake well. If it curls and scatters, someone in the house might fall ill. The children shiver, clutching their thin blankets, but also smile because in these stories, bread isn't just food. It's a compass pointing through the uncertainty of life elsewhere. Young lovers slip a small loaf into a shrine, whispering promises. A soldier heading to the frontier tucks a crust into his pouch, convinced it will bring him safely home. Widow sets aside her last loaf at night, not for herself, but for the spirit of her husband, so he won't go hungry in the afterlife. These small acts of bread folklore weave through the city like invisible threads, binding people to hope as much as to sustenance. And as you stand there, you realize that bread isn't merely survival. In Babylon, it's destiny. It predicts, protects, comforts, and warns. Every crack in a crust, every shared bite, every shaped loaf is a story told and retold. A quiet assurance that life, fragile as it is, still carries meaning. The grandmother hums softly, her fire dying to embers. The children curl up, their stomachs filled with scraps of bread and their minds filled with omens. You step away, the night deepening, carrying with you the sense that in Babylon, bread lived in two worlds, one of ovens and hunger, and another of dreams and symbols, and perhaps, in both, it was equally powerful. The night softens into early dawn again, and you sense the rhythm of the city shifting once more. But this time, something feels different. The courtyards are quieter, the scribal schools less crowded. You follow the flow of merchants and traders into a side street, where men sit not with temple tablets, but with their own small records, personal ledgers scratched. Unto clay. The old monopoly of scribes is waning. In the early days, every loaf was tethered to the temple, baked, tallied, sealed, distributed by priests. But now you see shopkeepers handling their own counts, traders noting their bread sales alongside jars of oil or bolts of wool. A baker in the corner smudges his thumb across a small tablet, muttering numbers, then tucks it away in a basket. He doesn't wait for a priest to approve his tally. He trusts his own math. Historians still argue whether this shift marked the decline of temple power or simply the rise of new economic independence. Some tablets suggest that private merchants kept detailed accounts, parallel to official temple records, almost daring the old system to keep up. Others argue the temples still reigned supreme, and these ledgers were just supplemental scribbles. Whatever the case, the authority of the stylus is spreading, loosening from the priest's hand into the grasp of ordinary men. A quirky detail you overhear. One trader boasts that his ledger is waterproof. He bakes his tablets in the oven so rain won't wash them away. He waves one proudly, hardened and permanent. sneering at the soggy tablets of less cautious merchants. You can almost picture him pitching it as a sales feature. Records that last forever, fireproof, rat-proof, priest-proof. The shift is subtle but enormous. Without priests tallying every loaf, bread starts to feel more like property, less like ritual. A soldier buys his ration directly from a baker. The transaction scratched quickly into a private ledger. A family sells onion loaves at market, recording sales with marks on a shard of broken pottery. The scribes trained in temple courtyards are still important, but they're no longer the sole gatekeepers. Numbers once divine are becoming personal, and yet not everyone welcomes the change. An older priest mutters angrily as he passes, glaring, at a group of young merchants with their clay notes. He sees rebellion in those private ledgers, a threat to the order that fed Babylon for centuries. Bread tallies were once sacred. Now their business, it's a quiet revolution carried, not by swords but by stylus. The marketplace hums with this new independence. You see bakers negotiating directly with customers, setting prices without temple oversight. They argue in barley, silver, or even loaves of different flavors. One man trades 3 sweet cakes for a jug of oil and writes it down himself, his tablet drying in the sun beside his stall. The temple scribes nearby roll their eyes but do not intervene. They can't stop the tide. You realize how different the city feels now. Bread hasn't lost its importance, but it's slipping from the priest's cosmic grip into the messy hands of ordinary people. With personal ledgers, merchants can cheat or prosper, innovate or collapse without divine oversight. Bread is still counted, but it no longer always passes through the temple's seal. Historians still argue whether this was progress or decline. Was Babylon becoming freer, more dynamic? Or was it losing the sacred structure that held it together? Perhaps both. Change always tastes a little like ash and a little like honey. As you step away, you glance at a discarded shard on the ground. Scratched into it are 3 marks, likely the record of loaves sold that morning. To anyone else, it's trash, but to the merchant who wrote it, it was proof of trade independence, maybe even defiance. Small symbols, big shift. And you can't help but think, the story of bread is also the story of power. Once divine, now mundane, yet always essential. Whether stamped with seals or scratched on shards, the math of bread keeps Babylon alive. And in this quiet transfer from temple to trader, you see the beginning of something new, an economy where bread is still king, but no longer ruled by priests alone. The streets are brighter now, the sun climbing high, and you sense the city's hum reaching a steady rhythm. Workers shuffle toward the gates. Bakers slap dough against oven walls. Merchants scratch notes into tablets. You pause, leaning against a wall warmed by centuries of dust, and realize you've walked through bread's entire journey in Babylon, from ovens to silos, from temples to ledgers, and everywhere, always, someone was counting. The final piece of this story isn't the bread itself, it's what the bread left behind. Because when the loaves crumbled, the crumbs scattered, and the people who ate them vanished, the math remained. Those little wedge marks, those imprints of seals, those private scribbles on shards, they survived. They whisper across millennia. Here, a soldier ate 3 loaves. Here, a priest took honey bread for an offering. Here, a family surrendered barley cakes in tax. You think about it, modern receipts, invoices, spreadsheets, they're descendants of these same clay tallies. Every time you check your grocery bill, you're echoing a Babylonian scribe hunched in the dark, pressing marks into wet clay. Bread was their paycheck, their ration, their tax, their medicine, their festival. And to keep it all straight, they invented record-keeping, one of civilization's most enduring legacies. Historians still argue whether writing itself began with bread tallies or whether it was wool, oil, or livestock that pushed humans to invent cuneiform. But the overlap is undeniable. Bread and math rise together, inseparable, like twin loaves baked in the same oven. Out of hunger and bureaucracy, writing was born. And from writing came history, quirky detail some ancient accountants doodled. Bread symbols so obsessively that modern scholars joke they were bread-obsessed clerks. Imagine being remembered not for your poetry or philosophy, but because you drew 5,000 tiny loaves into clay. Somewhere in the archives of Babylon, a man's life work is literally a bakery's ledger, still legible while his name is long forgotten. You walk past a row of crumbling archives where tablets lie stacked like bricks, each one carrying dusty rows of wedge marks. Some are cracked, others whole, but together they form a library of loaves. You run your fingers across the rough surfaces and feel the ghost of styluses long gone. The bread they counted has long been eaten, but the numbers endure. It's oddly. Poetic bread disappears, math remains. The city's rhythm continues around you. A baker pulls steaming rounds from an oven. A child tugs at his mother's sleeve for a bite. A scribe mutters as he smooths clay. An old man argues about barley. Prices! You smile, because it's all the same cycle you've been tracing: hunger, effort, tally, repeat. The bread is never just food. It is law, story, currency, medicine, symbol, and now legacy. And as the sun beats down, you realize the story of Babylon's bread isn't really over. It continues every time a receipt prints, every time a tax is paid, every time someone grumbles about shrinkflation at the grocery store. Bread and math are still intertwined, still shaping how we live, still reminding us that the humblest loaf once demanded an accountant. You take a deep breath, the smell of smoke and grain heavy in the air, and let the weight of it settle. Babylon has crumbled, its ziggurats weathered to dust, but its bread math lingers, alive in every ledger and spreadsheet on your desk today. Now the city quiets, the sun slips lower, its gold fading into soft bronze across the mud brick walls. The streets empty slowly, footsteps soft, voices hushed. Ovens that roared at dawn now glow with gentle embers, the last loaves cooling under woven cloth. You drift through the silence, past families huddled over their evening meals, past courtyards where children chew the last scraps of crust. The rhythm slows, each movement kneading dough, tallying marks, sealing jars stretches into something gentler, slower, softer. The scribes' styluses no longer jab at clay, but rest beside drying tablets, their wedge marks safe for the night. Guards lean on their spears, breaking small pieces of bread as they settle into watch. Priests murmur their final prayers, offering crumbs to the gods as the stars shimmer faintly overhead. The smells linger, a warm trace of smoke, a faint sweetness of dates, the earthy scent of barley grain. It hangs in the air like a lullaby, steady and grounding. You breathe it in, letting it sink into you, reminding you of all the hands that worked to keep the city alive. One loaf at a time. Your steps slow to the noise of arguments over missing bushels, the chatter of market stalls, the stern commands of judges all fade into memory. What remains is a quiet pulse, the simple act of breaking bread and sharing it. You picture the grandmother telling stories by the fire, the child giggling in a cloud of flour, the soldier tucking his ration into a pouch. Tiny moments, ordinary, yet each one glowing gently against the night. The stars spread wider above the city. Priests lift their eyes again, tracing constellations, but now their voices are softer, less commanding. The heavens seem less like rulers and more like companions, distant lights watching over a city ready for sleep. And as you tilt your head back, you feel the same comfort, a reminder that people long ago looked up at the same sky, holding bread in their hands, whispering the same small prayers for tomorrow. The air cools, the torches dim, families curl under thin blankets, bellies warmed by crust and stew. Children breathe deeply, drifting into dreams of feasts and stories. Safe in the rhythm of the oven and the cycle of grain, even the city itself seems to exhale, releasing the tension of disputes, taxes, shortages, and rituals. For a while, there is only stillness, and you, standing quietly at the edge of Babylon, feel the calm settle into you too. The weight of history softens, the dust of ages grows gentle. Bread and math may have built an empire, but tonight they rest. The tablets, dry in silence, the ovens cool, and the city sleeps, wrapped in the hush of its own breath.